My name is Claire Greensfelder, and together with my colleague Victor Minotti, we represent the International Forum on Globalization. I'll let Victor describe the International Forum, and after that we will then tell you about the efforts that we've been making and why we're here today together with the Emergency Coalition of Non-Governmental Organizations in support of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Victor will introduce the IFG and why we've got involved.
The IFG was formed in the mid-90s in the wake of the creation of the formation of the World Trade Organization as a response by grassroots groups from all over the world to give a counter story to what globalization was really about, because we saw it as the globalization of corporate power. And so one of the first demonstrations and mobilizations we had was in Seattle in 1999 when the WTO met, and there you had a handful of indigenous people, but they weren't so visible, but they were present. And we decided after that to try to elevate some of the indigenous issues in the globalization debate. And we got very involved in the declaration, because what we see is that the big picture here is a question of whose rights will global society enforce, and whose rights will be above who else's rights. What we have right now is the rights of the largest corporations who are enforced by the World Trade Organization. And what we see is a different set of rights, a universal rights, some of which are embodied in the UN Declaration Rights for Indigenous Peoples. There's also the human rights covenants, the International Labor Standard protections, all the environmental agreements. These are the rights that should have priority in the international system over the rights of exporters and patent holders and investors in the World Trade Organization. So we see within that context the struggle over indigenous rights and the UN Declaration as a very important international instrument to protect the rights of 350 million indigenous peoples and the lands and resources that are theirs rightfully. But we see this as just a very significant effort over the 500-year arc of history to recognize really the status that they should have and be recognized internationally. So we're deeply disappointed in the New Zealand government if in fact they are taking the negative position and leadership role that they've joined Canada and Australia in taking. The latest word we have about our own government, the US government, which we know has no pretense of being a human rights leader, never was, and with this administration certainly never will be, the Bush administration, that even they now are considering not voting against it, but abstaining from their vote, which means that New Zealand, who after all these years, or the last year, has carried the US and Canada's water on the issue, would now be out on a limb and voting against this declaration, while the U.S. has pulled back and is keeping silent by abstaining its own voice. So nobody wants to see New Zealand stuck out there, sticking your necks out with Canada and Australia, and we hope that cooler minds in New Zealand can prevail and fall on the right side of history in this decision.
One of the reasons that we at the International Forum on Globalization became involved in actively campaigning for the declaration is that we've spent a number of years researching the effects of globalization on indigenous peoples. We've published a book entitled Paradigm Wars, the globalized, indigenous peoples' resistance to economic globalization, that was co-edited between Jerry Mander and Victoria Tolley-Corpuz, who's currently the chair of the Permanent Forum of the Indigenous Peoples here at the UN. And in that book, we outlined stories of violation of rights of indigenous peoples by globalization of corporations all over the world. We also produced a map with hundreds of examples of the effects and impacts on indigenous peoples by economic globalization. It is a horrendous legacy. And yet, in spite of that, we find that we're also still out there fighting for indigenous rights because the governments of the world have not all come to agreement that this declaration, which basically guarantees right to self-determination, right to cultural integrity, right to practice your own language, so many right to free and prior and informed consent before any kind of mining or land exploitation can take place, the very basics that indigenous people are due and the very things that were violated again and again as represented by our research on the impacts of globalization on indigenous peoples. So when the Declaration did not pass last fall, we felt that it was behooved us to get involved and to get the global non-governmental organization community out in support of Indigenous rights, in support of this declaration, to stand behind their brothers and sisters in the Indigenous communities and say that it is not just Indigenous people who are calling for this, but it is the global citizen community that says the time is well come for the United Nations, the highest, most respected governmental body that brings all the nations of the world together, to codify Indigenous rights by passing the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And to that end, we've been organizing in the non-governmental community. And there are dozens of organizations that have come out today with us to support Indigenous rights and to support the Declaration. The list, I will read a few of them that you may know. We've had the Amazon Alliance, the Africa International Foundation, Trans-Africa Foundation, Amazon Watch, the Arid Lands Institute from Kenya, the Center for International Environmental Law here in the U.S., but it's an international organization, Cultural Survival, Earth Rights International, the Flying Eagle Woman Fund of the U.S., the Four Freedoms Foundation, Friends of the Earth in the United States, Global Exchange, Hawaii Institute for Human Rights, Enochi Plutonium-Free Future in U.S. and Japan, the Indigenous Environmental Network, the International Funders of Indigenous Peoples, the International Network for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Rivers Network, the Missionary Oblates Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation Ministry from U.S. and Italy, Oceana Human Rights, Oil Change International, Oxfam America, Oxfam Australia, the Rainforest Action Network, the Rigoberto Menchú Fund, the Sierra Club here in the U.S., the Solidarity Foundation, Survival International, the Sustainable Energy and Economy Network, Trans-Africa Forum, and the United Nations Association, the East Bay chapter in California. This is just but a small list of many this is just a small list of many non-governmental organizations from around the world who in the next 2 weeks, as this is coming up for a vote on September 13th, will be expressing their outrage to the governments of Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, in particular to Canada and New Zealand, and because we have counted on you in the past to be global leaders on human rights. Canada even sits on the Human Rights Council. These were countries that we could rely on to stand up for and speak out for the downtrodden around the world. We are horrified that we have lost your support on this issue. We are determined to do our best in the next 2 weeks before the vote comes up to convince you to change your mind. If there are any in Canada and New Zealand who have the authority and the right for parliamentary votes who are hearing this tape, we implore you to reconsider your position. We ask you to consider what part of history you want to be remembered by. When the world looks back on who supported the rights of the 370 million Indigenous peoples who are in 5,000 communities and nations spread around the globe, where will Canada's voice and vote be? Where will New Zealand's voice and vote be? We ask you to stand up for your principles, to walk away from this position that you are taking that is appalling and it is hypocritical with the rights and the respect for human rights that you've had for many, many years. We implore you, we ask you, we encourage you to think again and to join with the other nations in the world in supporting the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. They have been trod on for 500 years. The treaties have been broken, the agreements were abandoned, the lands were taken, the rights were trampled, the culture was left behind, and yet they have endured since the beginning of time. Now is the time for us to join with them, and we implore you and ask you to join with them as well. Thank you, and we respect your rights to decide for yourselves, but we know that there's one place where the right vote would come down, and that's in support of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And on behalf of the International Forum on Globalization and the Emergency Coalition of Non-Governmental Organizations to defend the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we call on you to vote yes on that vote. Thank you.
Peoples